It takes the average investor about 7.5 years to save and invest their first $100,000. But the leap from $100,000 to $200,000, that usually takes less than 4 years. And the jump from $400,000 to $500,000 happens in roughly 18 months. The math of wealth building operates on a deeply frustrating curve. The beginning is a grind. It demands the absolute most effort for the least visible reward. It feels slow, it feels unrewarding, and it is exactly where the vast majority of people give up. But once you cross a specific numerical threshold, the mechanics of money fundamentally change. Today, we are going to look at why the first $100,000 is mathematically and psychologically brutal. What happens behind the scenes while you feel like you are making no progress? And the exact moment your money stops being a burden and starts acting like a second income. To understand why the beginning is so difficult, we have to look at the engine driving your net worth. When you start at zero, you are the sole engine. Every single dollar in your account is a dollar you had to physically trade your time, energy, and labor to earn. You are doing 100% of the heavy lifting. In engineering terms, think of it like achieving orbital velocity. A rocket burns the vast majority of its fuel, just breaking through the lower atmosphere. That initial stage requires massive, violent exertion just to overcome the gravity of the Earth. But once it hits orbit, the environment changes. It requires almost zero fuel to maintain its speed because the physics have shifted in its favor. Your first $100,000 is atmospheric drag. You are fighting the gravity of zero. Because your account balance is small, the returns generated by your investments are also painfully small. Even in a phenomenal year where the market goes up 10%, a $5,000 portfolio only generates $500. That is nice on paper, but it doesn't change your life. It doesn't pay your rent. Meanwhile, you are working 40 hours a week, budgeting carefully and funneling your hard-earned cash into an account that seems to barely move. This creates a massive psychological disconnect. You look at your intense effort, you look at your tiny results, and you assume the strategy is broken. But here's the part most people don't realize. The strategy isn't broken. You just haven't reached the crossover point. There is a quiet transition point in every investor's journey that catches most people off guard. The crossover point happens when the annual return generated by your investments officially exceeds the total amount of money you contribute that year. Before this point, your savings rate is the most important factor in your wealth. You're dragging your portfolio uphill. After this point, your portfolio's growth rate takes over. The money itself begins generating more wealth than your physical labor can contribute. To understand exactly why this matters, we need to look at the numbers. Let's map this out with a realistic scenario. Imagine a 28-year-old earning $72,000 a year. They decide to invest 12% of their gross income, which comes out to $720 a month. We will assume a historically moderate 7% annualized return. Getting from $0 to $100,000 takes them about 8.5 years. That is almost a decade of consistent monthly discipline. And here is the brutal part of the math. Of that first $100,000, roughly $73,000 came straight from their own pocket. Only $27,000 came from investment growth. They did the heavy lifting. But watch what happens next. To go from $100,000 to $200,000, keeping their contributions exactly the same, takes just over 5 years. And of that second $100,000, only $44,000 came from their contributions. The market provided the other $56,000. The balance of power has shifted. For the first time, their money is working harder than they are. The interesting part happens when you extend the timeline just a little further. To go from $200,000 to $300,000 takes only 3.5 years. And for that third $100,000, the investor only contributes $30,000. The market generates $70,000. At this stage, the investor could completely lose their job, stop contributing entirely, and their portfolio would still likely grow by more each year than they were originally saving. They have reached orbit. but this assumes a smooth, predictable 7% return every year. And as we know, the real world does not operate on smooth averages. This introduces a psychological trap that derails many early investors. I call it the illusion of linear progress. Let's look at a different situation. Imagine someone starting a bit later. They are 35, earning $95,000 a year. Because they feel behind, they want to catch up aggressively, so they invest $1,200 a month. They do this perfectly for 2 years. They have contributed $28,800. But what if the market drops 15% during those 2 years due to an economic downturn? Their account value might drop to $24,500. They have been aggressively saving for 24 months, sacrificing lifestyle and consumption, only to be financially poorer than their raw contributions. On paper, this looks like a failure. It feels like they are throwing money into a furnace. But reality is telling a different story. During that downturn, their $1,200 monthly contributions were buying assets at a steep discount. The wealth wasn't destroyed, it was just coiled like a spring. When the market eventually normalizes, their money doesn't just bounce back to where it was, it accelerates. The foundation they built during the flatline drastically reduces the time it takes to reach their first $100,000 once the recovery begins. The mistake beginners make is judging their progress by their current account balance, rather than the number of shares they are accumulating. This brings us to an insight that fundamentally changes how you should view your early investing years. The primary goal of your first $100,000 is not actually to make you rich. If you're treating your first few years in the market as a wealth generation tool, you will be disappointed. Instead, you need to view your first $100,000 as an infrastructure project. Think of it like laying the foundation for a massive skyscraper. For the first year of construction, nothing goes up. The crews are entirely focused on digging deep into the ground, pouring concrete, and securing rebar. To a passerby, it looks like an empty hole in the dirt, but that unseen architecture dictates exactly how high the building can eventually go. Your first $100,000 serves the exact same purpose. The grind of those early years forces you to build the behavioral infrastructure required to manage real wealth later on. It teaches you the discipline to automate your investments every single month, regardless of how you feel. It builds the emotional control to ignore a 10% market drop without panic selling your assets. It forces you to design a lifestyle that allows you to save 15% of your income without feeling completely deprived. If you were handed $500,000 tomorrow without that infrastructure in place, the odds of you making an emotional, catastrophic financial mistake are incredibly high. If you can survive the brutal phase of saving your first $100,000, you have built the exact psychological skill set needed to handle the easy phase. You have learned to delay gratification, you have learned to trust the math, and you have learned to ignore the noise. The first $100,000 is a test of endurance, not strategy. It requires you to act as the primary engine for your wealth until your money grows large enough to take over the job. If your portfolio feels like it's barely moving right now, that doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It means you're still in the atmosphere, fighting the gravity of zero. The crossover point is mathematically guaranteed to arrive as long as you don't interrupt compounding unnecessarily. Focus entirely on your savings rate right now. Maintain your consistency through the flatlines. Let time do the heavy lifting, and recognize that the hardest part of building wealth is simply getting it started. If this mental framework changed how you look at your investing timeline, consider taking a moment to review your own automatic contributions this week to ensure they align with your long-term goals. Keep building, trust the math, and I will see you in the next one.